Hello and welcome back to Wyrd Wessex, the podcast hosted by two weirdos from Wessex. My name's Andy.
And I'm Craig. So before we get into today's topic, I've got a quick question for you, Andy.
Go on then.
If you're a king...
I am.
But
Sorry, go on.
Are you? If you're a king but you're a little bit sickly, what's the one thing you can do to prove you're tough?
I'd write a really angry, sort of sweary book about politics.
Pretty close. You'd write a really angry, sweary book about the devil.
I mean, one and the same, right?
So today we're diving into the mind of King James VI of Scotland, the scholar king who, in his own mind, was the champion destined to defeat Satan himself. James Stuart was born in 1566 and became King of Scotland just a year later. Feeble and sickly even as an adult, he was forced to cultivate an image of a devout intellectual rather than any kind of warrior. This need to demonstrate his strength through his mind became his greatest driving force. A strong believer in the supernatural, James, like many scholars in Europe at the time, blamed all workings of magic on the devil. He believed that spells or charms could not be used for beneficial purposes because the power of such things was given by Satan and could only harm or deceive. And this was a crucial theological position that justified state violence. If the power wasn't from God, it had to be from the devil, and therefore it was treason.
And this meant that under his rule, the persecution, torture and imprisonment of women accused of witchcraft became far more vigorous. Scotland's legal system was much more receptive to the idea of using torture to extract a confession than England's was at the time, which made it the perfect stage for James's paranoia. He truly believed the stakes were cosmic.
But perhaps he was right to be afraid, because before he became King of England and published his famous book on the subject of witches, both James and his new wife were under attack from witches. In James's mind, the devil wasn't just a threat to his soul, he was a political assassin. This belief wasn't just abstract, it was cemented by a series of real-life events that would traumatize him and justify his future brutality.
In the summer of 1589, a marriage was arranged between James and Anne, daughter of the Danish-Norwegian King Frederick II. James' previous avoidance of women and several high-profile and intense male friendships led to speculation that he was gay, speculation that continues to this day.
Nobles in Scotland were hoping the marriage would solidify alliances between the Protestant countries, as well as finally producing an heir to the throne. The pressure on the sickly king to perform this dynastic duty was immense, which made the subsequent storms feel like a personal assault. After the ceremony was conducted by proxy in Denmark, Anne attempted to sail to Scotland to meet her new husband when unseasonably severe storms forced her to land in Norway, and James, a notorious coward, had to brave further bad weather in the North Sea to safely fetch his bride home. This initial disaster became the literal proof of treason that underpinned every subsequent execution.
The entire royal voyage was a disaster, and James could not accept that it was simply bad luck. The rumours that the royal couple had been attacked by a coven of witches who were behind the storms began soon after. There was talk that one of the witches had even sailed to the Firth of Forth on a sieve to raise the wind, which duly proved her guilt as a witch and would be regicide. In 1590, several women, Anna Coldings, Karen Weffers, Maren Matsbriggers and Maren Magensis, were trialled in Copenhagen for sending demons in barrels across the sea to attack the hulls of the royal ships. Anna Coldings was interrogated until she named 4 other women, leading to the execution of at least 12 women in Copenhagen, demonstrating the cross-cultural panic that infected James. The North Berwick witch trials were held a year later, starting a bloody chain of events driven by the king's terror.
It started with 2 actual witches, or rather cunning folk, Agnes Sampson and Gillis Duncan, and a long-time rival of the king, Francis Stuart, the Earl of Bothwell. Under the 1563 Scottish Witchcraft Act, simply consulting with these folk healers was a capital offence, so James already had the legal hammer he needed.
Gillis, or Gilly, was a popular healer until her employer, David Seaton, tortured her with thumbscrews and forced her to confess to witchcraft. As part of her confession, Gilly named Agnes Sampson, another healer with many patients among the local nobility. Agnes was already under suspicion after she persuaded the spirit of a black dog to leave the home of a wealthy man using a Latin prayer. And as every good Protestant knows, consorting with spirits is witchcraft, but praying in Latin suggests she might have been guilty of something far worse. The other, old religion, the one the king was really scared of. This is, of course, Catholicism.
Both women instantly caught James's attention when they confessed to collaborating with the coven in Copenhagen to work towards the staying of the Queen's coming home. This turned their witchcraft into high treason. James, desperate for personal proof of this satanic plot against his divine right to rule, had them moved to Edinburgh, put to trial and tortured again, this time with his full blessing.
And this is where it gets incredibly ugly. James himself took a personal interest in the interrogations, adopting the brutal methods popularized in the continental texts like the Maleficarum. The
Maleficarum!
The confessions became increasingly elaborate and fantastical under this extreme duress. Agnes Sampson was subjected to the pillywinks, which are those finger-crushing sort of thumbscrew things. The scold's bridle, which is an iron instrument with four sharp prongs that are forced into the mouth, and was fastened to a cell wall. And it's horrifying to note that other victims may have been subject to the breast ripper, which is a gruesome device that consists of four pronged levers that would encase the breast of the accused witch and then tear it from their chest with a considerable amount of trauma. Agnes' confession, which included reciting the precise private words James had exchanged with his queen on their wedding night, was the moment the king ceased to be merely sceptical and he became fully convinced. Agnes, likely completely broken by pain at this point, told the king that the devil himself had told her that the king is the greatest enemy he hath in the world. This was the moment James found the narrative that he so craved.
Gilly implicated several of her friends and neighbours and named Francis Stuart, the Earl of Bothwell, as the ringleader. Francis Stuart was a powerful, rebellious cousin with a credible claim to the throne. By framing Stuart as the devil's chosen agent, James could legally brand a major political rival as an unholy traitor. In 1591, Gilly was strangled on a stake and then burned, the standard punishment for witchcraft at the time. Francis Stuart bravely ran away, and because he was an earl with the support of noble people and access to legal advice, he was eventually acquitted. And another was the literate schoolmaster Dr. John Fian, who was allegedly the coven's clerk and kept their register. He initially refused to confess, so he was tortured so severely that his fingernails were forcibly extracted and iron pins thrust into the raw flesh underneath. When that failed, they crushed his legs in the boot, a brutal shin press, until his bones broke. He was finally strangled and burned, serving as a terrifying example that no one, not even an educated man, was safe from the king's paranoia.
Can I just add that it strikes me as remarkable that a coven, like this secretive, demonic kind of underground movement, that would get horribly tortured and killed if found out, have a paper trail with a clerk. Like,
Well, you got to have your expenses down, though, ain't you?
that's
For
it.
your
Like,
tax deductible.
No, your taxes work out, but you're spending a lot of money on black cats, newt size, and broomsticks. It's and cauldrons.
Yes.
Yeah, sloppy. Keen to present him an image of himself as both the true enemy of the devil and as a competent scholar, James began work on his Daemonologie. And he wasn't just messing around either. He was deeply offended by gentlemen like Reginald Scott, who had written about witchcraft skeptically, suggesting the whole thing was just a load of nonsense. James wrote Daemonologie as a direct royal counterattack, structuring it in form of a dialogue between a skeptic and an expert. The entire book is essentially a piece of propaganda where the king's views systematically shut down all doubt. It's an assertion of his personal power and his God-given authority. Which leads us right to to his main question. How do we know witches exist? Well, according to James, we know they exist because, and I quote, "In the law of God is plainly prohibited," this referring to Exodus 22:18, "thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. And it's certain is it that the law of God speaks nothing in vain." So, witches definitely exist because God says so. So there. Okay. But why would Almighty God permit such a abomination? Although man in his creation was made to the image of the Creator, yet through his fall having lost it, it is but restored again in part by grace only to the elect, so all the rest, falling away from God, are given over to the hands of the devil. That enemy, to bear his image, and once being so given over, the greatest and the grossest impiety is the most pleasant and most delightful to them. In short, the devil makes them do it. How does the devil tempt people into using this magic and sorcery? Even by these three passions that are within ourselves: curiosity, thirst for revenge, or a greedy appetite for possessions. These three desires tempt people into using magic, power in which can be gained by making a pact with the devil, and once they have taken him as their master, he will teach them how to use it.
According to James, the beginner's curriculum includes all that which is called vulgarly the virtue of word, herb, and stone, which is used by unlawful charms without natural causes. He goes on to give examples such as the kind of charms as commonly daft wives use for healing of forspoken goats, preservation from the evil eye, curing the worm, turning the riddle, or doing innumerable things by words without applying anything to the part affected. Customs like forespeaking, placing a harmful verbal charm or curse, and curing the worm, a painful internal ailment, were instantly elevated from simple folk practices to evidence of a capital crime.
Some of these might need some explaining, especially turning the riddle, which might sound like a euphemism, and I was hoping it was, but it's actually one of the oldest forms of divination in the Western world. First described in ancient Greece, it's a method similar to using a dowsing rod or a pendulum. Exactly how it is performed is unclear. One image from the time has a pair of shears held by the handle, with the riddle, a kind of sieve, held between its open blades. But more likely, the wooden rim of the riddle was balanced on the tips of the shears. Then you use an incantation, most commonly calling upon St. Peter and St. Paul, although Cornelius Agrippa, a Renaissance doctor, philosopher and occultist, argued for the pleasantly incomprehensible Deus meus geshet benedofet dewima anitamus, along with a question, whereupon, according to Agrippa, a demon is summoned who causes the riddle to turn. The witch then finds the answer by interpreting the turns of the riddle.
Typical of most folk magic of the time in its use of the names of saints along with common household objects, the riddle and shears is mentioned in several witch trials, most notably the Salem witch trials, where Rebecca Johnson, one of the many accused, confessed to conjuring with the riddle and shears, describing a ritual in which a sieve was balanced on a pair of shears and the rotation of the sieve was used to divine if a family member had been killed. But these so-called daft wives were also using their charms for darker purposes. James was especially concerned with Maleficarum, the actual physical harm caused by magic. This wasn't just about divination, this was about murder by unseen means. For example, he mentions how witches often inflict an illness known as the worm, a term used for a variety of painful, creeping and inexplicable internal afflictions. And what was the most horrific thing a witch could do with these charms?
Well, it was a method that was supposed to have been used against James himself, using magic to raise storms. This was usually done by ritually desecrating a corpse or a saintly object and throwing it into the sea. A crime that went from local mischief to an act of regicide and high treason, punishable by the most extreme torture and eventually execution.
Exactly. James, along with the church, believed that such charms and folk medicines only worked so that the devil could further trick people into believing that he had power, and that witches were actually only effective in their spells or fortune-telling because of their contract with him. Describing the casting of a circle, James states that it is no power inherent in circles or in the holiness of the names of God blasphemously used, nor in whatsoever rites or ceremonies at that time used, that either can raise an infernal spirit or yet limit him perforce within or without those circles. For it is he only, the father of all lies, who having first of all prescribed that form of doing, feigning himself to be commanded and restrained thereby, as likewise to make himself so to be trusted in these little things, so that he may have the better commodity thereafter to deceive them in the end with a trick once and for all. I mean the everlasting perdition of their soul and body. Was he on word count when he wrote this Daemonologie?
Absolutely.
Gotta get the words up.
That's it. It didn't matter if you thought you were an honest, merry man or woman, a simple raving creature, or a magician or necromancer employed by a Christian queen. Using magic put you firmly in league with the devil. That old crafty enemy, writes James, finds the proper time to reveal himself to them, either walking solitary in the fields or else lying brooding in their bed. He either by a voice or in the likeness of man inquires of them what troubles them, and promises them a sudden and certain way of remedy. Once you have agreed to meet with him and become addicted to the benefits of his service, he reveals his true self, and if the witch agrees to renounce their baptism, he then does lick them with his tongue in some private part of their body, under the hair, whereby it may not be easily found or seen, in order to bestow upon them the famous witch's mark. At the third meeting, the new initiate is taught how to obtain gain and worldly commodities by most vile and unlawful means. The devil's kiss of shame, the osculum infame, was another deeply secularized, degrading detail forced out of women under torture. To the church, the physical act of kissing the devil's anus was the final, vile renunciation of Christian purity, proving that the female body was the ultimate corruption in itself.
James makes a distinction at this point between magicians, as allured by curiosity, and witches, for whom the whole practice is either to hunt men or their goods.
Like the Malus Maleficarum, a similar text written around a century earlier, Daemonologie states that there are far more women than men involved in witchcraft, because women are weaker and so much easier for the devil to deceive. The Malus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, was written by a German clergyman, Heinrich Kramer, though much like Daemonologie, it was probably more a compendium of earlier folklore and tradition rather than a truly original work. Considered particularly rabid in its suggestion of how suspected witches should be tortured, the text was heavily criticised by fellow theologians for being heretical as well as nuts, but its popularity, especially in King James's day, could not be denied, and it was almost certainly one of the books James drew upon when he wrote his own. The Malus Maleficarum established the witch's absolute servitude to the devil. James simply translated that logic into a legal mandate for the British state.
As well as good old-fashioned misogyny, there is a class distinction here too. Magicians and necromancers were literate and often used grimoires in their magic, while cunning women were more likely to be from poor backgrounds, using practices handed down to them. One was a pursuit of curiosity that might earn you a royal pardon, and the other, the hunting of men or their goods, earned you the stake.
Great
steak.
Burning steak. A great example of the distinction would be the magician John Dee. Considered to be a learned astronomer, astrologer, alchemist, and mathematician, Dee was a powerful and respected figure in the court of Elizabeth III.
Nice to see you.
To see you, nice.
You just went a bit Brucey when you said Elizabeth the First.
Elizabeth the First. Elizabeth the First. How many? Higher or lower? Higher or lower? Second? Second? We go with second? A great example of the distinction would be the magician John Dee, considered to be a learned astronomer, astrologer, alchemist, and mathematician. Dee was a powerful and respected figure in the court of Elizabeth I. His occult practices, such as summoning angels and scrying with crystal balls, was written works of influence later sorcerers, including Aleister Crowley himself. Days before James I passed his new stricter witchcraft statutes into law, Dee sent a letter to the king complaining that it was a most grievous and damageable slander to print against him that he hath been a conjured or caller or invocatory of devils. Dee's frantic letter, begging to be cleared of conjurer slander, shows just how much the king's new Daemonologie terrified even the intellectual elite. In Dee's mind, in the opinion of many others at the time, he was a good Christian who had attempted to use magic to heal the rift between Catholics and Protestants. James ignored him and refused him financial aid when he needed it later in life, but other than that, the Cambridge-educated Dee was left to live out his days in relative peace, despite the fact that his own transcripts of spirit communications were evidence enough to have him hanged 1,000 times if he had been a witch. The king's consistent refusal to help Dee was the ultimate silent verdict. Dee's magician's knowledge was deemed curious, perhaps, but ultimately useless to the state. It is witches, not magicians, who oftentimes confess their form of adoration to be the kissing of his hinder parts. This is the devil, who use poisons, poppets, and charms to break apart relationships, cause madness, disease, and death, or raise storms and tempests, and it is only earnest prayer to God and the swift execution of these witches, of course, that can cure their victims of such afflictions.
There are even records of trials where women were convicted for owning certain magical texts, when the authors of those texts were never arrested for the same crime, because an upper-class man writing a grimoire is simply spiritual inquiry, but a common woman owning a book is witchcraft. The life of Dr. John Fian perfectly illustrates the moment James realised his rules had to apply to everyone if his obsession with the devil's treason was to hold up. James writes that the only way to be safe from the craft is to seek out suspected witches and punish them as aggressively as possible, encouraging his people to accuse their own neighbours. But perhaps the common folk were wise to fear the spirits that stalked the earth or rode the winter winds. Belief in fairies was rife in the 15th and 16th centuries. They were beings who lived in the unseen places, under rocks, within ancestral mounds, or inside hills or trees, who could cure or cause sickness, trick humans, or help them. Beings who were sometimes spirits of the dead, nature spirits, or strange otherworldly creatures. Spirits who were unseen but everywhere at the same time. Some of the interactions between accused witches and the devil were actually described by the accused themselves as relationships with fairies or spirits, like in the case of Bessie Dunlop, a Scottish healer who was found guilty of consorting with evil spirits and the devil, but clearly claimed in her own confession that her knowledge of healing came from a ghost of a local man and a fairy queen. The folk world and the devil's world were utterly intertwined in the minds of the people.
King James calls them the fourth kind of spirits, which by the pagans was called Diana and her wandering courts, or, their name among the people, our good neighbours. So called, as the saying goes, for the same reason you say good doggy to a dog that wants to bite you. Just placate them, you know? This pagan link to Diana was important to James. It showed these practices were vestiges of a non-Christian, uncontrolled past. This sort of wild, heathen ancestry that he was sort of trying to get away from. James states that the belief in fairies was one of the illusions that was rifest in the time of papistry. A vain prattle founded upon the illusion of how there was a king and queen of fairy, of such a jolly court and train as they had, how they had a tithe and duty, as it were, of all goods, how they naturally rode, went, ate and drank, and did all the other actions like natural men and women. As I spoke various times before, the devil deludes the senses of many simple creatures, in making them believe that what they saw and heard, such things as were nothing so indeed. He refers to the fact that many witches have gone to death with the confessions that they have been transported to the fairies, with the same answer: these witches have been deluded by the devil, as well as anyone else who might have been troubled by unclean spirits. Even so, I say, he deceives the witches by attributing himself to diverse names, as if every different shape that he transforms himself into were a different kind of spirit. In James's mind, Bessie Dunlop was simply confused. She met the devil, not a fairy queen.
To conclude his Daemonologie, James discusses the trial and punishment of witches, as he would like to see it. They ought to be put to death according to the law of God, the civil and imperial law, and municipal law of all Christian nations. What kind of death? Well, James says fire is the best way because burning is both the most painful and the most spiritually purgative. But even in Scotland during his reign, witches, including the North Berwick conspirators, were strangled and then burned. And both in the rest of Europe and the New World, hanging was by far the most common way to dispatch a witch, showing that while James preferred fire, the legal reality often meant the hangman's noose. And this is the most terrifying part of his legal theory. Consulters, trusters in, overlookers, entertainers, or stirrers up of these craft folk are equally guilty with themselves that are the practitioners. So enabling a witch is just as bad as actually being one, as is, according to James, failing to punish one properly. As far as he saw it, it was impossible to be falsely accused of witchcraft because God would not allow innocent people to be killed, thus making the entire legal process far more straightforward. And this is the ultimate guardrail for the witch hunter. If they die, they were guilty. I pray God to purge this country of these devilish practices, for they are never so rife in these parts as they are now.
As the trials concluded, the scope of James's paranoia, his subsequent legal actions, began to change the entire nature of witchcraft persecution across the British Isles. When he became King of England in 1603, he immediately repealed the existing Elizabethan law and replaced it with his own, much harsher Witchcraft Act. This new law made it a capital offence to consult with or even entertain familiar spirits, directly reflecting his obsession with the North Berwick Confessions. Yet the legal machinery he established in Scotland took on a horrific life of its own. It led to the Great Scottish Witch Hunt of 1661 to 1662, a massive wave of panic long after James himself was gone. The 4,000 to 6,000 people eventually tried for witchcraft in Scotland, which was a far higher rate than in England, stand as a brutal legacy of the Daemonologie and the North Berwick obsession.
And that terror wasn't just confined to Scotland, oh no. James's obsession created a climate of fear that went straight into England, especially once he became King James I of both countries. The most famous or infamous example of this is Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed Witchfinder General. He wasn't some official government agent, he was just a chancer, an impoverished, failed lawyer born in Suffolk who rocked up in East Anglia during the chaos of the English Civil War in the 1640s. With his partner, John Stern, Hopkins basically took James's ideas from the Daemonologie, which he even cited in his own handbook, The Discovery of Witches, and ran a profitable, brutal business. He and his team sent more people to the gallows for witchcraft, an estimated 230 to 300 people in 3 years, than all of the other witch hunters of the previous 160 years combined. He got paid a fee for every town he cleansed, which only motivated him to find more suspects. This terrifying, violent and frankly exploitative legacy was all legally underpinned by the strict Witchcraft Act that King James had passed back in 1603.
His methods were utterly barbaric, exploiting the legal vacuum left by the collapsed county courts. Hopkins devised ways to prove guilt while skirting England's ban on full torture. Confessions were wrung from suspects using techniques like watching and walking. Now, this was a method where suspects were made to stay awake for days and nights on end, sometimes forced to walk continuously or sit on an uncomfortable stool. This sort of utter psychological torment was designed to break their will and prevent the devil or their familiars from reaching them and giving them any assistance. There was also the swimming test. The bound victims were thrown into a river based on the absurd belief that water would reject a witch and sort of hurl them back out. If the victim sank and drowned, she was declared innocent. If she lived, floating, she was guilty and promptly hanged. There was no winning in this, you know.
I think they also used ducks.
How do you know this woman is a witch? And what else floats? There was the pricking test. He focused on a specific indicators of guilt: witches' teats and the devil's mark, patches of skin insensible to pain, which his prickers would stab with retractable needles to feign insensitivity, which is really sneaky, you know. He also condemned the mere presence of pets, instantly branding them as familiars.
The fact that almost half of the English witch trial deaths occurred in just the 2 years Hopkins was active in East Anglia is the ultimate proof of the danger of James I's legal framework. Now, legend tells us that the villagers eventually turned on Hopkins himself, accusing him of witchcraft and making him take his own swimming test, which led to him being hanged. while in reality he returned to Manningtree and died of consumption in 1647. But it's a wonderfully satisfying piece of folklore, isn't it?
Mm, absolutely.
It's nice to think that he got his comeuppance from his
Yeah,
own methods,
it's
but sadly not
yeah.
true.
The horror, though, it even transcended the grave, entering popular culture. It's no coincidence that Shakespeare's Macbeth, written for King James's court in 1606, opens with the three weird sisters. It's a good name. Um,
Band name?
Summoning storms and speaking in riddles, a direct nod to the North Berwick trials and the king that was so proud of mastering. Unfortunately for James, despite his best efforts, folk magic continued to be rife in the lands that he once ruled. In the 1800s, folklorist Alexander Carmichael wrote the Carmina Gadelica, a compendium of prayers, law, songs, and incantations that he'd recorded from Scotland. While this is hardly the grimoire of ancient Celtic style paganism some later writers hoped it would be, the collection reveals a strong belief in charms and blessings that wouldn't have been out of place back in the 16th century. The weird was never truly extinguished. In fact, while British Parliament did repeal James's stringent laws against the actual sort of witchcraft in 1736, a new act made it a crime to claim to have magical powers, viewing such people as frauds rather than devil worshippers.
This is where we bring James's influence right up to the modern era. This seemingly archaic law, descended from the one that condemned so many of the unfortunate souls, was, unbelievably, used over 2 centuries after the witch hunts peaked. The Scottish medium Helen Duncan was the last person to be jailed under the Witchcraft Act in 1944, right in the middle of World War II. She was arrested because she held a seance where she allegedly revealed the sinking of the HMS Barham, a fact the British Admiralty was trying to keep secret to avoid damaging wartime morale. Fearing she might reveal sensitive information about the upcoming D-Day landings, the authorities charged her with pretending to raise spirits from the dead under the Witchcraft Act of 1736, which ironically had been passed to target fraudulent mediums, not actual witches, and had replaced King James I's original harsher law. She was convicted and sentenced to 9 months in prison, essentially for being a security risk during the war. It finally took until 1951 for the UK to fully repeal that archaic legislation, finally burying the last of King James's disastrous legal legacy. In February 2025, a new tartan was registered, the Witches of Scotland tartan. Created by campaigners Claire Mitchell-Casey and Zoe Zendatozi, this memorial tartan used its colours, black and grey for the ashes of the executed, and red and pink for the binding legal tape to honour the thousands of victims of the Scottish witch trials and push for an official pardon. Who knows? If you venture into the woods or the secret glens, perhaps you might spy one or two modern practitioners. Though these days they tend to focus on engaging with their landscape rather than licking the devil's arsehole.
um,
Yeah.
I mean, it was still going like in the 1700s. One of the last witches to be condemned to death was actually a lady in Hertfordshire. It was a lady called Jane Wenham. She was uh, she was accused of cursing a lady called Anne Thorne, who was apparently seen running through the brambles, tearing at her clothes and screaming Jane Wenham's name. She was accusing of like cursing two children that died back in a time when sort of mortality rates were pretty iffy. She was accused of cursing cows, and they couldn't get her on any of that. They couldn't get her on any of that because people were starting to be a bit more enlightened. This was 1712,
Yeah.
and eventually the priest that was really going after her was it was fraternizing with a familiar, a cat that had the face of Jane Wenham, apparently, that people swore they'd seen. And so they couldn't get her for being a witch. And so they accused her of consorting with the devil, of making a pact with the devil rather than like straight up witchcraft. And you know how they got her? she basically gave it to her on a plate to get through, but she stumbled on the Lord's Prayer, which is understandable, as this old lady who's being vilified by the town, and she
Mm.
stumbles upon the Lord's Prayer, and they sentence her to death.
Wow.
Luckily, Earl Cooper and Colonel Plumer, who were educated and quite into the whole Enlightenment thing, petitioned, and she ended up getting a royal pardon. But she had to move out of Walken, her village, because they were pretty convinced the villagers would have just lynched her. Um, there was another
Mm.
case. Um, it was Ruth and John Osborne who were accused of witchcraft in a little Hertfordshire village, and they actually didn't wait for that. The law wasn't interested. They're like, it's bollocks. We're not interested. And so the villagers um, took it into their own hands and did a good old-fashioned ducking. They did the test of water far, far like after this was a thing. Just going to find out what the date was exactly, but this was, yeah, 1745, and it was near Tring in Hertfordshire, and they took them to the ponds upon, yeah, it was over a dispute over some milk or something, and apparently a bunch of the cows that the chap owned got distemperament afterwards, and therefore proof that she was a witch. And so, yeah, they took him to a ducking stall or into the pond, and they sort of dragged them out eventually, and they basically stripped them naked. John survived, but Ruth died. The shock, the water, it killed her. Thankfully,
Mm.
the authorities came in, and Thomas Colley, who was one of the sort of main antagonists here, was actually sort of basically sentenced and hanged for murder pretty quickly afterwards. But yeah, I guess my point is these stories pop up all over the place. Um, so while she wasn't like condemned to death, she died anyway. So that belief was still in the village mindset even after it was out of the legal system, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Overall, it is just something that speaks to that horrible desire that we have in ourselves, and not just from those in power, but ourselves to sort of other people and target, maybe through fear of being targeted ourselves. It goes from witches to being like, sort of and Catholics to witches to anarchists and people accused of homosexuality, and then communists, and now it's like terrorists, and it just goes through. It's just something to accuse people of. Yeah, I mean, I picked up this actually. We went recently to the witches markets, and again, what a contrast! Like, sort of a few hundred years later, you've got witches markets happening. Um, Grabbed
Mm.
that at the witches market the other day. I was like, I should write an episode on this, and then Emma beats us to it.
She'd been
But
working on it for a while, to be fair. And
no, I know.
yes, a shout out to Emma who wrote the bulk of this episode.
Absolutely. I'm glad Craig took most of the hard to pronounce stuff. But yeah, I
Yeah.
imagine witches will be something we come back to, because this is quite a fascinating one. And also, shout out to Tabitha Stanmore. I've been reading this actually, and it's a fantastic book as well, Cunning Folk, which sort of talks about it, but also draws on a lot of the old remedies that are recorded, and sort of how to save lives, how to get rich quick, or I'll bookmark that one. How to gain a kingdom, and so it's like historical examples and the actual processes involved. So
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, the main sources that Emma used was obviously the Daemonologie.
fantastic.
There's various translations. This is Donald Tyson's Daemonologie of King James I. I believe she also used this one, which is Cunning Folk and Familiar Spirits by Emma Wilby. And very briefly, a couple of little bits were added from these as well, which is Witchcraft, A History in 13 Trials by Marion Gibson. And the Book of English Magic by Philip Kergom and Richard Haygate.
Oh, I need a copy of that one. That looks awesome.
That's actually the book that, in fact, those two books are the books that I bought when we were distracted in Glastonbury and should have been following the dragon.
So yeah,
So it
this
all
is the
comes
payoff,
around.
which was about a year ago,
Almost to the day, actually, as we
almost to
record
the
this.
day. Yeah, as of
There you go.
recording.
I still haven't
Um,
read them from cover to cover.
One day, I would love to go to the British Library and have a peek at the Malus Maleficarum.
Ooh, Maleficarum.
They won't let us in if you keep doing that.
We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure, we've got more books on witches. There are so many stories. It might be, yeah, we do one on the Pendle or Salem. It might be that I mean, there's such a vast.
Yeah, so when I was at the Woman's the Thing anniversary conference, I
Mhm.
met Paul Boswell, the Woman's the Thing artist that did the mural.
Fantastic, yeah.
Um, and semi-randomly, I don't know why exactly, but he mentioned we should look into the Witches of Selwood. So I do have a book on my list of something to cover. So yeah, witches will come back around, I'm sure.
So yeah, we will come back to this topic, no doubt. But that brings us to the end of our dive into the dark mind of King James VI, or King James I.
I mean, our episode last week was on Guy Fawkes, apparently, I guess, because depending on how we put this out.
Yeah, I was going to say, it does seem we've got a bit of a thing for King James. I assure you we do not.
Though he has a thing for us.
Maybe, maybe.
I hear he was that way inclined.
If you want more on witches, check out our previous episode, Witches of Wessex from last year. And remember to like, follow, and leave us a review if you'd be so kind, as it does help with listener numbers. Fight the algorithm. You can find us on social media for more weirdness at Wyrd Wessex on all platforms apart from Instagram, which is at Wyrd_Wessex. Our
And we are
blog,
back on TikTok now, by the way.
we are indeed, we are indeed. They let us back on as long as we behave. Our
I've stopped
blog,
showing my penis.
I mean, overall, we're all very glad of that. Our blog and website is www.weirdwessex.co.uk, where you can also find our exclusive merch. Got some new bits up there, I believe.
There is a Guy Fawkes up there as well, very relevant to this.
Indeed, indeed. Buy all the shirts, piss James off, or be cursed by witches. And for the bonus material and the latest weird news, check out our bonus show After Weird. We'll catch you next time for more strange history from the two weirdos of Wessex. So until next time,
Stay weird.
Stay weird.